Hey, what's up everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I discussed the evolution of slavery and the many ways in which, despite the fact it was looking to the Founding Fathers as though it was an institution on the wane, that it was on its way out, that at some point in the very near future, from their perspective, it would be gone, it managed not only to persist after the revolutionary phase into the early 19th century, but actually grew substantially in the first few decades of the 1800s to become this integral institution in the United States, even though it was only present in mostly the southern states at that point. In this episode, I'm going to do something kind of similar. I'm going to talk about the evolution of religion in the United States in the late 17 and early 1800s. Specifically, I'm going to be covering the movement that is known as the Second Great Awakening. I already talked about the First Great Awakening a few episodes back, that it was a grassroots religious movement that diversified Protestant religion in particular in just about every region of the country to one extent or another. That's where some of the most prominent denominations in the United States today come from. The Methodists, the Baptists, and so forth have their origin point in the First Great Awakening, and it's where religion becomes somewhat democratized. It is not an institution dominated by elites who have a lot of education or religious training, and the Second Great Awakening is a movement that goes very much in the same direction and becomes even more profound in its effects. So that's what I'm going to discuss today. I decided to focus on this issue in particular because it has a profound impact on the way that the United States develops over the course of the next few decades in the history that we're discussing, that is the early 19th century, and really throughout the rest of U.S. history. The United States, to this day, continues to be a pretty religious country relative to other wealthy democracies in the world, and I think the roots of that are very much in this period, in the early 19th century, when the Second Great Awakening transforms religion in a number of really important, impactful ways that make it, I would call, a vital piece of American culture, of American politics, of the economy in some ways. Religion continues to have a really important role in the United States in a way that it doesn't, honestly, in a lot of other wealthy democracies in the world, other countries that we would compare ourselves to in terms of the form of government and the economy and the standard of living of the people who reside in those countries. I decided to do this because I read what I thought was a very insightful chapter on the movement in Empire of Liberty, the book by Gordon S. Wood that is in the Oxford History of the United States series I've been using for a lot of these episodes, and it's something that is discussed in the other books that I've used for research thus far as well. Give Me Liberty, the APUSH history textbook, The American Pageant, it's in there as well. I thought the Second Great Awakening merited discussion on its own, separate and apart from other things, because of how it reflects other changes that went on in the United States in the early 1800s and back to the late 1700s, and that it has this long-lasting influence over the country in general in many ways that are very important. So I wanted to cover it by itself. Without further ado, we will go ahead and get into it. When Thomas Jefferson imagined the future of religion in America, he thought it would wither away, replaced by reason, science, and enlightened self-interest. In 1822, Jefferson even predicted that not a single young man alive would die without becoming a Unitarian. He couldn't have been more wrong, as it turned out. Instead of fading away, religion erupted. In towns, fields, forests, Americans gathered by the thousands, praying, shouting, fainting, and singing in ways that would have scandalized the genteel, buttoned-up clergy of colonial America. Out of the American Revolution's chaos and freedom came the Second Great Awakening, a democratic religious movement that transformed the spiritual, social, and political life of the young republic. Today, we'll explore how evangelical Christianity helped shape a more democratic, more emotional, and more populist America, where Methodists and Baptists outnumbered the old elite churches, where women and black preachers found new space to lead, and where religious competition, like political liberty, became a hallmark of the American experiment. Before I go any further, if you have not done so already, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, like the post if you're enjoying what I've been doing so far. It really does help the channel to grow. So if you could do that, subscribe, spread the word to your friends and family maybe if you think they might be interested. That would be awesome, and it would really help me to continue to do this. So if you're enjoying it, please like, please subscribe, please spread the word. Thanks very much. As usual, I'm going to give you all a question to think about as I go through this, and that is as follows. In what ways did the evolution of organized religion in the United States following the Revolution and continuing into the first few decades of the 19th century reflect the evolution of political and economic dynamics and institutions during the same period? I'll say that one more time. In what ways did the evolution of organized religion in the United States following the Revolution and continuing into the first few decades of the 19th century reflect the evolution of political and economic dynamics and institutions during that period? So think about that as I'm going through this. I think it'll help you to get a better understanding, a deeper understanding of the stuff that I'm going to cover. On the eve of the American Revolution, religion among American elites appeared to be in serious retreat. Leading figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson rarely spoke of Jesus Christ. Jefferson went even further, privately ridiculing the clergy as allies of tyranny and describing the Trinity as nothing more than hocus pocus. Many founders leaned toward deism or Enlightenment rationalism. That's something I covered in depth in a podcast a few months ago. Religion, the founders thought, should be private, reasoned, and dignified, not public and passionate. The dominant churches on the eve of the Revolution at the time, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, eventually it would become the Episcopalian Church once the Revolution succeeded. In the South, that was where the Church of England, the Episcopalian Church, was dominant, and the Congregational Church in New England, also the Presbyterian Church to a somewhat lesser extent. The dominant churches, were weakened by war, disestablishment, and internal divisions. Clergy lost their elite status in the wake of the Revolution. The proportion of college graduates entering ministry declined rapidly, and a lot, if not, a very healthy percentage. I don't know exactly off the top of my head how many, but a lot of the early colleges and universities in the United States started off as seminaries, effectively, to train ministry. But during the Revolutionary period, church membership fell off, graduates entering the ministry declined, and by some estimates, only 5% of Americans were formal church members. But that number, 5%, is a little misleading, if not quite misleading, because for many American churches, especially those hardcore puritanical ones in New England, church membership required a personal conversion experience. It was not an automatic birthright membership like it was in many European churches. There were elites, the clergy, who were the gatekeepers of these important institutions, the churches. Most Americans still turned to religion to explain the world. Earthquakes, droughts, and epidemics were viewed as divine punishment. People still knelt in prayer and sought grace in everyday life. So it's not as though religion all of a sudden totally disappeared in importance in the lives of many Americans. Religion, in fact, had not disappeared. It had just gone underground, I guess. I'm not sure that's quite the right word for it, but, not out in the open, out in the mainstream, not a part of public life for a lot of Americans. And it went underground in the sense that it had grown most significantly in the United States outside of elite-controlled institutions. In this way, the augmentation of religion in America mirrored the way in which political power and institutions were augmented. They were both becoming more controlled and influenced by the middling sort, as the elites often referred to average Americans. I've used this terminology in previous podcasts. Or common people, not from the traditionally elite classes of European or European-descended societies. The emphasis on democracy and republicanism in American politics in the late 1700s and early 1800s manifested itself in religion in the same way that it had manifested itself in politics. The Enlightenment values of many founders didn't reflect the beliefs of the broader population. To most ordinary people, rationalism was not a satisfying substitute for revelation. The secularism of the educated elite coexisted uneasily with the grassroots and religiosity of farmers, artisans, and laborers, while elite discourse of the Founding Fathers types, the George Washingtons, the Alexander Hamiltons, the Thomas Jefferson and John Adamses of that period, while those elites and what they talked about centered on liberty and reason, common people continue to organize their understanding of the world through faith and spiritual language. The American Revolution shattered the traditional bonds between church and state in the United States. In Virginia, Jefferson and Madison led the charge to end religious taxation and disestablish the Anglican Church, the Episcopalian Church. The 1786 Statute for Religious Freedom declared that civil rights had no dependence on religious opinion. For many years in the colonial period and for the very early years of the Revolution and immediately afterward, religious association was still an important part in being a public figure and in being a politician or someone who was a leader of some kind. There still were sort of some religious tests that existed. But figures like Madison and Jefferson, they rejected that. They wanted not just the freedom to do what you want and not be persecuted for it. They wanted the freedom to worship however you wanted and experience no negative consequences from how you chose to worship or how you chose not to worship. Disestablishment is a term I've thrown around a little bit now. It means that there is no longer an official state church of a particular state, or certainly of the United States. That is in the First Amendment of the Constitution. But a lot of states, especially in the years immediately after the Revolution, still had official state churches. That started to change a lot in the early 1800s, even before then, actually. So once the churches were divorced, so to speak, from their state sponsorship, disestablishment meant that churches had to survive in a competitive religious marketplace. They no longer had the safety of state taxing resources to back them up and build their ministry. Instead of declining, like in Enlightenment Europe, American religion thrived precisely because it was voluntaristic, not state-sponsored. People could choose their denomination or none and still be full citizens and Christians in good standing. Alexis Tocqueville, later noted that religion gained more authority in America because it was separate from political power. However, many states retained Christian overtones, blasphemy laws, religious tests for office, and taxpayer-funded support for multiple Protestant denominations lingered in some of the states into the 1830s. They were very much in a minority, but it was still a thing when you got to the 1820s, 1830s. Still, the broader arc was clear. Religion in America was becoming more decentralized, democratized, and self-funded. With no official support from any government, churches had to attract adherents through persuasion and participation. This led to more emotional services, broader outreach, and a greater emphasis on conversion. Clergy of these new churches and denominations became less genteel and more entrepreneurial. New denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists thrived under these conditions, while older, established churches like the Anglicans, Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, and Congregationalists struggled to adapt to the new conditions on the ground. Between 1770 and 1790, by way of example, the number of church congregations in the United States more than doubled, which outpaced population growth. Baptists grew from 94 congregations in 1760 not long after the First Great Awakening, to 858 by 1790. Methodists, who had virtually no presence before the Revolution, exploded to 700 congregations by the same year of 1790. Catholicism, meanwhile, followed a very different path. In Europe, the Catholic Church was closely intertwined with monarchical and hierarchical state power, and it was governed rigidly from Rome, from the Vatican. But in post-revolutionary America, Catholics had to adapt quickly to a religious environment defined by volunteerism and competition. John Carroll, who was the first appointed Catholic bishop in the United States in 1790, worked to Americanize the Catholic Church. He supported the use of English in the liturgy, in the everyday rituals and sermons and services of the Catholic Church. He encouraged lay involvement, the involvement of average people, not clergy. And he also emphasized that American Catholicism was independent of direct Vatican control. In doing so, in doing all of these things, Carroll helped structure the Catholic Church in the United States as one denomination among many, competing for adherents like its Protestant counterparts. Lay trusteeism, as it's called, is a practice, or was a practice, still is, I guess, in which congregants elected parish leaders and oversaw church finances, rather than having the responsibilities for those things rest solely with Catholic officials. And this practice of lay trusteeism reflected this uniquely American approach to Catholic church building, if you want to call it that. While the Catholic hierarchy in Europe resisted such democratizing tendencies, in the United States, these changes became a necessity for survival in a crowded religious marketplace, which is what it was. Beginning in the 1790s and peaking in the 1820s and 1830s, the Second Great Awakening unleashed a wave of revivalism that spread across the country. It began in earnest on the western frontier, especially in Kentucky and Tennessee, as they were just becoming states, where social upheaval and isolation created a hunger for spiritual connection. If you can imagine the lives of those people out on the frontier, there isn't a lot connecting them with the rest of society. It could be isolating, and they yearned for some kind of real link to other people and to the community that was closest to them. One of the most famous events in this early stage of the Second Great Awakening was the Cane Ridge Revival of 1801. As many as 20,000 people gathered, which was a gigantic crowd for that time. Pretty rare that you would get more than a few hundred people in any one place back in the very early 1800s, let alone 20,000. Dozens of ministers from different denominations preached simultaneously. People fell to the ground, convulsed, cried out in tongues, or were slain in spirit, as the expression goes. It was chaotic, emotional, and profoundly democratic. These revivals spread rapidly through itinerant preachers, often poorly educated, but charismatic and tireless. Methodist preacher Peter Cartwright, for example, traveled over 10,000 miles a year on horseback, organizing camp meetings and preaching to crowds across Ohio, Kentucky, and Illinois. Cartwright, described scenes where hundreds fell like dead men, according to him, under the power of a single sermon. Camp meetings became a staple of American religious life. They weren't just religious events, though. They were social gatherings, marketplaces, and often the only community event for miles around. You can imagine that because hacking your life out of the wilderness didn't leave you a lot of time to socialize. They helped create a modern religious culture in an otherwise fragmented frontier society. New sects also emerged. There were the Shakers, there were the Universalists, and other millenarian groups, as they were called, that predicted the Second Coming or experimented with communal living. And just to clarify, millenarian means that there's going to be this 1,000-year period of utopia under the authority of Jesus Christ and God, and some thought it would take place before the end of the world, and some thought it would take place just after the end of the world, but that was a belief that there would be this 1,000-year reign of glory for Christians. Some of these groups, these new religious utopian communities, created a great deal of controversy with their new religious doctrines or radically different views of how to live a Christian life. Shakers, for instance, believed in total celibacy. I guess it's not really surprising that they didn't last much beyond that original generation, although I think, if I remember correctly, the Shakers were big into this whole end of the world belief. That might explain to some extent why they were celibate and didn't see much of a future. Religion was becoming more emotional, more participatory, and more accessible than ever. Revivalism emphasized personal transformation. Converts were expected to experience a sudden emotional rebirth. This new birth experience became the hallmark of evangelical Christianity. Salvation was not inherited, it was earned through conviction and confession, which was a very different standard than the old puritanical Calvinism that preached the idea of predestination, where God knows even before you're born whether you're one of the elect who are going to heaven. The new lights of the Presbyterian Church and the Methodists and Baptists who embrace the doctrine of salvation through righteous living, good works, and accepting Jesus Christ as one's Lord and Savior through adult baptism were more in line with the American ethos of taking action to dictate one's destiny rather than the old idea of predestination in which you're sort of born to what you are and can't really do much to change it. That doesn't sound very American when you think about it. Of course, as I alluded to earlier, the Second Great Awakening didn't just change theology. It shaped who could lead and what religion looked like. Preachers came from humble backgrounds, as I mentioned a moment ago, and very few had formal religious training. Their authority came from charisma and conversion, not credentials earned at elite seminaries or colleges. Women found new space as public exhorters, prayer leaders, and moral reformers during the Second Great Awakening. Some joined or even founded sects with radically egalitarian ideals. African Americans played a central role in many churches as well. Free black leaders like Richard Allen founded independent churches such as the AME, or American Methodist Episcopal Church. Enslaved people also embraced evangelical faiths and sometimes led integrated congregations before being segregated again as a part of the backlash against African Americans and sort of a re-emphasis of slavery in the early 1800s that I discussed in the last episode. Figures like Lorenzo Dow, who was one of the most prominent, impactful, itinerant preachers of the early 1800s, further embodied the populist character of the Second Great Awakening. Dow was an eccentric, self-taught Methodist who traveled tens of thousands of miles in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. He preached to huge crowds while sleeping outdoors and dressing like a biblical prophet. He was likely the most widely heard preacher in America in his time, and his writings went through dozens of editions when printing written material was the most important form of mass communication in the country. In the deeply hierarchical society of the planter aristocracy-dominated South, evangelical Christianity took root more slowly, but eventually spread through every state. Enslaved people found hope and meaning in the story of deliverance and spiritual equality that evangelical Christianity had to tell. Despite efforts by white ministers to use Christianity to reinforce obedience, black congregants developed a parallel theology of liberation from servitude and equality of all before God and Jesus Christ. You could see how that would appeal to them. These revivals emphasized free will, not predestination. Again, free will sounds more American, right? The old Calvinist belief that God had already chosen the elect gave way to the idea that anyone could be saved if they chose Christ. This resonated with the new spirit of American democracy. People were told that they could change their fate, not just in religion, but in life. Religious fragmentation also became the norm. Presbyterians split into the old and the new lights, while Baptist and Methodist splintered into countless subgroups. There's all kinds of different versions of Methodism and Baptism and Baptist churches now, if you look around. The competition was intense, but it kept churches vital and responsive to their congregants' needs. Religion became increasingly decentralized, mobile, and populist throughout every part of the United States as the 1800s went along. Evangelical Christianity became a key part of the emerging American character. Its values mirrored those of the new republic. Volunteerism. Just as citizens chose their government, believers chose their faith. Moral responsibility. Conversion required self-examination and moral reform. And social reform. Religious groups pushed temperance, that is, limitation or elimination entirely of alcohol consumption, Sabbath observance, not doing much of anything on the Sabbath, prison reform, missionary work, universal public education, and eventually, and very importantly, abolitionism. Religious life also helped stabilize communities amid rapid change. As people moved west or navigated the uncertainties of market capitalism, religion provided identity, belonging, and moral guidance, of course. Economic, social, and political life was rapidly evolving in the United States in the early 1800s, and Americans sought solace and community in their religious beliefs. Women especially turned to churches for leadership roles and communal support in both rapidly changing cities and towns and on the isolated and dangerous frontier. Even public education was infused with Protestant moral values. Bible reading, hymn singing, and religious textbooks shaped the early curriculum of the growing number of publicly funded schools in the early 1800s. Religious reformers believed that shaping children's character was essential to sustaining a moral republic, as was being literate enough to read the Bible for themselves. In the view of a lot of people, whether they were religious or political leaders or some combination of the two, you had to have a moral, upstanding, educated populace in order to have a moral, upstanding, righteous, and functional democratic republic. Benevolent societies, often led by women, sprang up to tackle social ills. Groups like the American Bible Society and the Female Moral Reform Society aimed to uplift the nation through spiritual and civic virtue. The Tract Society and the Sunday School Union distributed millions of religious pamphlets, books, and of course Bibles all over the country to spread the word. The founders, as again I discussed at length in an episode a few months ago, like Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and so forth, didn't anticipate any of what I have been discussing. Jefferson, as I mentioned earlier, thought rational religion like Unitarianism would prevail. He was blindsided by the emotional populism of evangelical revivalism. But evangelical Christians weren't anti-government entirely, to be clear. They didn't want a theocracy, for the most part. I mean, I think some did, but most didn't. But what they did want was laws that supported public morality. They pushed for blue laws, which are laws that restricted activities on the Sabbaths, like they wanted to close down stores and the mail service and things like that. They pushed for chaplains in Congress, and they wanted official days of prayer and thanksgiving. They, the evangelicals, who became a part of the Second Great Awakening in one way or another, envisioned a Protestant moral nation without formal church establishment. So they wanted a community of religious Americans, but they didn't want some kind of formal association between a particular Christian church and the United States. They wanted religious association to be free and for people to have the choice of which denomination, which sect they would join, and not to have the government, whether at the state level or at the federal level, put its thumb on the scale for one particular denomination or sect or group or whatever. This was not top-down religion. It was a mass movement from below. Jeffersonian Republicans often gained support from evangelical groups, especially Baptists and Methodists, who distrusted elite-controlled churches like the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians. Even conservative clergy who had once disdained revivalism came to accept its power. they kind of couldn't avoid it because they would have faded to irrelevance if they had tried to totally ice skate uphill against this thing. Religious authorities had to adapt or risk irrelevance. The result was a realignment of religious authority around the sensibilities of the common man or the middling sort, as I've mentioned a couple of times now. So the Second Great Awakening was a revolution of the heart, of the spirit, you could say, in the same way that the American Revolution and the Jeffersonian revolutions were political and social revolutions. The Second Great Awakening, created a populist, pluralist religious culture that rejected hierarchy and embraced competition, emotion, and choice. It empowered women and Black Americans, and it spread to the margins of society while helping draw Americans back into religious communities rather than the society becoming more secular, as was the case in Europe throughout the 1800s. For many Americans in the rural West, their churches provided the only sort of community available to them and helped give them a sense of stability in a world that was rapidly changing. That's one of the things I really took away from the chapter of Empire of Liberty that I read, is that the institutional foundation of churches was really important to a lot of Americans, particularly in the West, at this time. Far from dying out, religion in early 19th century America flourished. Not despite liberty, but because of it. The result was a uniquely American blend of democracy and devotion. Religion offered a moral foundation for the market revolution, a shared culture in a nation whose geography and demographic diversity were expanding, and a language for reform and resistance to those who wanted either or both. The Evangelical Republic wasn't what the founders imagined, certainly, but it was what many Americans created from the ground up. And it reflected pretty clearly, in my mind, what was the democratizing of just about everything in early 19th century America. So thanks very much for listening. As always, again, please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Please spread the word if you would like to do that. I would certainly appreciate it. Thanks for listening or watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.